The phone rang. At first I thought it was a mistake, but when I saw the name flash across the screen, Lucas, it hit me like a punch to the gut. 20 years, 2 decades of silence. 20 years of wondering whether he was dead or worse, whether he simply didn't care anymore. I had given up hope long ago. I stopped trying to reach out, stopped holding onto the memories of his first steps, his first words, his first baseball game. All those years gone. I let the phone ring for a few seconds longer, staring at it like it was some strange, unwelcome visitor from a past I had buried. I thought about hitting ignore. I thought about sending it to voicemail and pretending it wasn't happening, but I couldn't do it, not this time. This wasn't some random telemarketer or an old acquaintance calling to ask for favors. This was Lucas, my son, the one who had walked out of my life without a word, with a deep breath. I swiped the screen. The sound of his voice flooded my ear, the same voice I hadn't heard in years, now tinged with the weight of age, but still carrying that same underlying arrogance. "Hey, Dad, it's been a while, huh?" I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who disappeared from your life without so much as an apology, and now, after all these years, expects things to be as they were? His words were casual, like we'd spoken just last week. He was the same Lucas, the same charming tone, but I could hear the subtle shift in his voice, the difference in how he spoke now that he knew what I'd become. "Lucas," I said slowly, letting the weight of his name hang in the air. I could feel my pulse quicken, my body tense. "What do you want?" There was a long pause on the other end, one that stretched too long, like he was trying to figure out how to say what he needed without sounding too obvious. Then finally, the words came. "Well, Maddie and I were talking, and we thought it'd be nice to have you over for Christmas. Family time, it's been way too long, and it would really mean a lot to us." Christmas, the word sat in the air between us like a weight. I could feel the lump in my throat. Christmas had never been the same since he left. I spent those holidays alone, watching the world go by, pretending I was fine, sending cards he never received, no phone calls, no visits. Just silence. The quiet had become my companion. But now, after all these years, after all the birthdays and holidays I had spent alone, he was calling. Not to make amends, not to fix anything between us, but to invite me for Christmas dinner. His invitation, wrapped in the veneer of family time, was more like a cold business transaction, an offer with strings attached. The words stung more than I cared to admit. I felt a knot twist in my stomach, but it wasn't the invitation itself that shook me. It was what came next, the casual mention of my success. The thing I had worked for all these years after he had left and I had to start over. I could hear the shift in his voice as he slipped in his real reason for calling. "I've been hearing a lot about your success lately," Lucas said, his tone smooth, almost too smooth. "That big property deal you closed, right? Must feel pretty good, huh? Congratulations." There it was, the real reason he called. The reason after 20 years of silence he suddenly wanted to reconnect. It wasn't for me. It wasn't because he missed his father. It was because he saw an opportunity, a chance to benefit from what I had worked so hard to achieve. I could feel my chest tighten, the bitterness rising like bile in my throat. The years of estrangement, the years of pain and loneliness were all reduced to one simple thing in his eyes: money. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, steadying breath. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him what I had been through, how I had spent those years missing him, waiting for him to come back. But I knew better than to let my emotions get the best of me. This was my moment. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "I'll come," I said, my voice calm and steady, betraying none of the fury I felt bubbling inside me. "But I've got a surprise for you." The silence on the other end of the phone was almost deafening. I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head, the questions rising, trying to figure out what I meant. The anticipation hung in the air between us, thick and uncomfortable. He didn't know it yet, but he had just made a grave mistake. He thought he was in control. He thought he could walk into my life after all these years and use me like an ATM, a means to an end. He had no idea that I wasn't the same man he had left behind. Christmas dinner would be just the beginning. I had a plan, and this time the game was mine. The days that followed Lucas's phone call moved slowly. The world around me seemed to move at its usual pace, people bustling through their daily lives, cars honking on the street, children laughing, and the soft hum of the city carrying on as if nothing had changed. But for me, it was as if time had warped, each hour dragging on, stretched thin by the heavy weight of the past resurfacing. As I walked through my quiet home, each step felt heavier than the last. The walls, Once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign, as if they were closing in on me. I hadn't lived in this house for long, but it already felt like a relic of a different life, before the divorce, before Lucas left. The old furniture, the cracked windows, the peeling paint on the front door, all of it seemed like echoes of a time I had been forced to leave behind. I hadn't expected to be here at all. The plan had been to rebuild my life, far away from the ghosts of my past. But there I was, standing in the middle of a house that felt more like a tomb for all the unspoken words and unresolved feelings. I found myself staring at the kitchen table, the same table where we used to sit for meals, the place where Lucas had once argued with his mother about his grades, and where I'd spent countless nights trying to fix things that were already broken. The table felt like the center of everything, every memory, every wound. That morning, I had gone through my routine as usual. I had gone for my walk, bought my groceries, sat down with a coffee, reading the paper as I always did. But the normality of it all felt like a mask, covering the storm brewing inside of me. The call from Lucas had peeled back layers of old wounds I hadn't even realized were still open. The phone call wasn't just a simple invitation, it was a reminder. It was a reminder of everything I had lost, everything I had given up, and everything I had worked so hard to bury. 20 years, I kept thinking, 20 years of silence, and now this. As I sat down at the table, my mind wandered back to those days, the days when everything had been different, back to the beginning. Lucas had been my pride and joy, my son, the boy who had once looked at me like I was his whole world. The days when he'd climb into my lap after school, the way he would laugh at the stupid jokes I told. The way we'd work on the car together in the garage, those days felt like a lifetime ago now. But things had changed, like they always do. The world had gotten bigger and Lucas had gotten older. I'd spent too much time at work, trying to make ends meet, trying to secure a future for us both, and in doing so, I'd lost touch with him. He had always been driven, talented, the kind of kid who could talk his way out of anything. He had big dreams, but somewhere along the way, those dreams turned into something darker, more about status, more about connections than about family. I'd watched him slip away, bit by bit, until one day I came home to find that he and his mother had left. No note, no goodbye, just an empty house. It wasn't the first time our marriage had fallen apart, but it was the last. The divorce was quick, cold, and final. I kept fighting, kept trying to salvage the scraps of my family, but Lucas was gone. His mother, Linda, had taken him, and I was left in an apartment I couldn't afford, with nothing but a broken heart and a pile of bills. That's when I started to rebuild. At first, I thought I was rebuilding for us. But as the years wore on, I realized I was rebuilding for me. I didn't need them. I didn't need anyone. I was going to prove to myself that I could survive, that I could make something of myself without the weight of the past dragging me down. So I threw myself into work, real estate deals, property flips, anything that could get me back on my feet. And it worked. Slowly but surely. I rebuilt myself. The success came slowly, but when it did, it was sweet, and it was all mine. Now, sitting in my small kitchen, my fingers wrapped around the mug of coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. The same old loneliness, the same familiar ache, but this time it was different. This time I wasn't just waiting. I wasn't just passively hoping. I had something to offer now, my success. The property deals, the business moves that had turned things around for me. Lucas didn't know it, but this time I wasn't the man he had left behind. He thought he could come back into my life like nothing had changed, like we could pick up where we left off. But he was wrong. I had a plan now, and I wasn't about to let him manipulate me into giving him something for nothing. The phone call was only the beginning. I had already begun gathering what I needed: documents, records, evidence of everything Lucas had been involved in, the failures, the lies, the hidden debts. I had spent years learning how to play the game, how to read people, how to spot weaknesses, and I knew Lucas. I knew him better than he thought I did. This time I wasn't going to be the one caught off guard, but as I prepared, I couldn't help but feel a pang of something I hadn't felt in years. Guilt. I didn't want this. I didn't want to do this, but Lucas had given me no choice. I didn't ask for this. All I wanted was to be left alone, but if I was going to survive this encounter, I needed to be cold, calculated, and most importantly, I needed to be prepared for anything. The days passed, and soon Christmas was upon me. I spent the time cleaning up, getting ready, not for the dinner I was about to attend, but for the confrontation. I didn't care about the decorations or the food or any of the usual trappings of the holiday. This wasn't about family for me. It was about setting the record straight. The evening of the dinner arrived. As I prepared, I took one last look at myself in the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, older, yes, but not weak. The man who had stood in the cold after the divorce, the man who had built himself up from nothing, was still in there. Lucas might have thought I had forgotten everything. He might have thought I was just an old man now, vulnerable and eager to please, but he was wrong. I wasn't who he thought I was. I wasn't just his father. I was someone who had learned how to survive, and now I was about to make him understand that. The day Lucas invited me to Christmas dinner came quickly. I had spent the days leading up to it in a blur, a mixture of detachment and careful preparation. I had my plan in place. My folder was ready, neatly organized with everything I needed to confront Lucas with the consequences of his actions. And yet, as I stood in front of the mirror that evening, something was stirring in me, a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. It wasn't that I was afraid of seeing Lucas again. No, I was well beyond that, but after all these years, I had no idea how this was going to play out. What would he be like now? The boy I had known, the one who used to curl up on my lap, tell me about his school day and share his dreams, was long gone. The man who had replaced him, the one who had walked away without a word, was a stranger. But I knew one thing for sure: I had changed too. The drive to his house felt like a dream. My mind was both calm and racing at the same time, and as I approached his neighborhood, I could already feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. The houses, all pristine and neatly arranged, stood like sentinels, watching me as I drove by. The lights twinkling on the lawns, the cheerful decorations on the doors, everything screamed normalcy, a facade that stood in stark contrast to the storm inside me. When I pulled into the driveway of Lucas's house, my hands were steady, but my heart pounded in my chest. I sat there for a moment, just looking at the place. It was bigger than my house, more polished, and there was a sense of success that I hadn't expected. In those fleeting seconds, I almost hesitated, but then I reminded myself why I was here. I stepped out of the car and made my way up the path toward the door. As I reached for the doorknob, I paused. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I wasn't just going to show up and let them carry on with their little act. No, I was going to see this through. I had nothing to lose now. The door swung open and there was Lucas standing in the doorway with that familiar smile of his, the one that used to make me feel like the luckiest man on earth. His eyes, though, betrayed him. They were sharp, calculating. I could see the way his gaze flicked to the briefcase I was holding. Then quickly back to my face. He wasn't fooling anyone. "Dad, you made it," he said, his voice warm, but I could hear the thin layer of forced enthusiasm beneath it. "Come on in." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Maddie appeared behind him, giving me a quick, practiced smile, and ushered me inside. The house was everything I expected it to be, perfectly staged. Everything had its place, every item seemed meticulously chosen to reflect the image of a family who had it all together. There was a fire crackling in the hearth, a table set for 12, and the smell of prime rib filled the air. It was a picture-perfect scene. Kind you'd see on a Christmas card, but I saw past the picture. They were all here, the people who had spent years ignoring me, who had cut me out of their lives without a second thought, and now they wanted something. Maddie gave me a glass of wine, her hand lingering just a second too long on mine as she handed it to me. I took the glass, eyeing her. There was nothing genuine about this woman, and I could feel it in my bones. Everything about this evening felt rehearsed. Forced, like a play where the actors knew exactly when to hit their marks. I scanned the room, noticing how everyone greeted me with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Ethan was seated on the couch with his 2 children, Ava and Jake. They didn't even look at me when I walked in. No hello, no recognition. It was like I was invisible to them. Not that it mattered. They didn't know me. They only knew what they were told about me. The version of me that Lucas had built for them, the one where I was the absent father, the man who had failed them. I tried to ignore the discomfort rising inside me. I was here for a reason, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. Dinner began, and the conversation was as shallow as I expected. They asked about my business, about my success, but no one seemed interested in anything beyond that. Lucas kept steering the conversation back to his big plans, investment opportunities, real estate deals, and some new project he was working on. The same talk I'd heard from him when he was a teenager, eager to impress anyone who would listen. He had changed, but then again, hadn't we all? As the meal ended, Lucas motioned for me to follow him into the den. I didn't need any more cues. I knew what was coming. I had prepared for this moment for weeks. Months even, I had everything I needed in the briefcase, and I was going to make sure that Lucas knew exactly what it felt like to be caught in the act. We walked into the room, the firelight flickering across the walls. The room was quiet save for the crackling of the logs. Lucas sat across from me, a little too eager, a little too tense. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on me. "So," he began, a forced smile playing on his lips, "I've got something big I'm working on, a new project, and I think you'd be interested. Big returns, minimal risk. We could really use your help." I didn't respond right away. I could see the way he was watching me, waiting for my reaction. The old Lucas, the one who had always been so sure of himself, so confident in his charm, was still there, but now there was something else. I saw it in his eyes, desperation. I opened my briefcase slowly, letting the silence hang in the air. The look on his face faltered just for a second, but he quickly recovered. "What's that, Dad? You brought something for me?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I pulled out the first document, sliding it across the coffee table toward him. It was a bankruptcy filing from his last venture, a failed business, one I had discovered while digging through his past. The look on his face changed instantly, the color draining from his cheeks. "What's this?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Your business deal," I said coldly. "The one you've been keeping hidden. It's all right here, your signatures, your debts. You thought I wouldn't find out, didn't you?" He looked down at the papers. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted to Maddie, who had entered the room behind him, her expression unreadable. But it didn't matter. The moment had arrived. The truth was out. Lucas stared at the papers in disbelief. The room seemed to close in around him. I slid another document across the table, a property tax notice, unpaid and overdue. Then another and another. Each document was a piece of the puzzle. Each one pulling Lucas further into a trap he had no idea I had set. "You think you can come back into my life after all these years, using me, taking advantage of everything I've worked for?" I said, my voice low but filled with purpose. "You thought you could walk in here, smile, and get what you wanted, but it doesn't work that way anymore, Lucas." He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't know what you're talking about." His voice was desperate now, the facade cracking. "This is business. It's what I do. This is for the future, for all of us." But I wasn't listening anymore. I was done with excuses. "You don't get to use me anymore, not like this," I said, standing up. "I'm not your pawn, Lucas. I'm not some old fool you can trick into writing checks for your failures. This is what you've built, your lies, your manipulation, and now you'll deal with it." I reached into the briefcase one last time, pulling out the final piece, the deed to his house. "You bought our mortgage?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Yes," I said, "and I'm giving you the chance to fix this. Sign the deed, walk away clean, or you can keep fighting it and lose everything." Lucas had been quiet for the longest time after the documents were revealed. The room was heavy with silence, the fire in the hearth crackling loudly in the background as if mocking the stillness between us. He stared at the pile of papers in front of him, his face pale, his jaw clenched tight. Maddie was behind him now, standing with her arms crossed, her gaze flicking between Lucas and me. It was like watching a man unravel in real time. "You did this." Lucas finally whispered, his voice breaking. He reached for the papers, his fingers trembling slightly as he fumbled with the sheets. "You've been digging into my life all this time. You were just waiting for this moment, weren't you?" I didn't say anything. The weight of his words hung in the air. What was I supposed to say? That I had been waiting for the perfect time to expose him? That this was the culmination of years of pain, of watching him destroy himself and, by extension, the family we had once been? I wasn't waiting for this moment, not really, but it was here. It had to happen. I had to know the truth, I said quietly, my voice steady. "I wasn't going to let you walk back into my life like nothing had happened. You've been lying to everyone, Lucas. You've been lying to yourself." He didn't respond. Instead, his gaze shifted toward Maddie, who had remained eerily silent throughout the entire confrontation. She was no longer standing with the confident poise I had seen earlier. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights, as if she wasn't sure which way to turn. "Lucas," I said, my tone hardening, "you thought you could just use me for your gains, but this isn't just about money. It's about everything you've taken from me, from us." Maddie glanced at him, then back at me, but said nothing. She was, after all, part of this web. It wasn't just Lucas I needed to confront. It was the entire lie they had created. The manipulations, the deceit, the way they had turned my life into a mere stepping stone for their ambitions. Lucas, who had once been so sure of himself, now sat hunched over, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. The facade he had built for himself was crumbling piece by piece in front of me. He had always been the golden child, the one with the bright future, the one who had the charm to get out of any situation. But now the mask was gone, and all that was left was the man beneath it, the broken man who was facing the wreckage of his own choices. "Why, Dad?" he finally asked, his voice small, almost a whisper. "Why didn't you just let me do this? I was trying to build something. I thought you'd understand." The words hung in the air, thick with emotion. He was pleading now, pleading for understanding, for forgiveness, for something, anything to make it right, but it wasn't right. It hadn't been right for years. "You think I don't understand?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "I get it, Lucas. I get that you were trying to build something, but at what cost? You think you can just walk back in here and act like everything is fine because you've got money. You've always thought you could buy your way out of every problem, but it doesn't work that way anymore." I could see the fight draining out of him. His shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. He was no longer the confident, charismatic man who had walked into my life just hours ago. This was the real Lucas, the one who had never fully dealt with the consequences of his actions, the one who had never faced the pain he had caused. "I didn't mean for things to get this bad," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix us." For a moment, I almost believed him. For a moment. I almost let myself soften, almost let the flood of memories, the good times, the bond we once had, cloud my judgment, but I stopped myself. This wasn't about me. This wasn't about what I wanted. This was about him facing what he had done, about taking responsibility for the damage he had caused. Maddie stepped forward, her expression unreadable, her movements slow and deliberate. She stood behind Lucas, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. But her eyes never left me. "You've done enough," she said, her voice cold. "You've made your point." I turned my gaze to her, my eyes narrowing. "Made my point," I repeated. "You've been a part of this too. You think I don't know what's going on here? You think I don't see the way you've been playing this game too? You've been pulling the strings just as much as he has." Her lips twisted into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You don't know anything." She spat. "You think you have all the answers, but you don't. You think you're some kind of hero for exposing all this. You're not. You're just another bitter man trying to get revenge." "Revenge?" I scoffed. "This isn't revenge. This is about me finally taking control of my life. This is about me not letting you two walk all over me anymore." Lucas looked up at Maddie, his eyes pleading with her now. "Maddie, stop, just stop." But she didn't stop. Her gaze shifted back to me, colder now than ever. She took a step back, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her entire demeanor a defense mechanism. I saw it in her eyes. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let me win. The tension in the room thickened. Lucas was still shaking his head, the reality of everything setting in. His eyes were glazed over, his body slumped with the weight of what he was facing. This wasn't just about business deals anymore. This was about everything he had neglected, everything he had walked away from. I stood there watching him, feeling the deep ache in my chest. This wasn't how I had imagined it would go. I hadn't wanted to destroy him, but the years of neglect, the hurt, the lies, they had all built up to this moment. "You're broken, Lucas," I said softly, my voice almost a whisper now. "You've broken everything, and I'm done pretending like you didn't. You've hurt me, and you've hurt everyone around you, but most of all, you've hurt yourself." And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I saw it in his eyes, the understanding, the realization that the life he had built on lies, on manipulation, was crumbling. That everything he had worked for, everything he had taken from me, had finally come to an end. The room was silent, save for the soft crackling of the fire. There were no words left. The breakdown had come. The walls had fallen, and the only thing left now was the fallout. The stillness of the house after everything had happened was deafening. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a low, quiet ember, leaving the room bathed in soft, warm light. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade and the snow settle on the ground outside. It had been a long day, a day filled with confrontation, anger, and finally, the painful release of emotions I'd kept locked inside for too long. But as the hours passed and the house grew quieter, I realized that the anger, the hurt, the constant need for validation, none of it had made me feel whole. None of it had brought me the peace I so desperately needed. All I had wanted, all I had ever wanted, was closure, an apology, a reason why everything had gone wrong. But now, sitting in the silence of the aftermath, I knew something more profound than closure was required: understanding. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my own thoughts, my own emotions. Without the crutch of blame, I had been carrying the anger for so long, it had become a part of who I was, but now that the storm had passed, I could feel it slipping away, leaving behind something unfamiliar. I wanted to hold on to that feeling of release, but I was also terrified. Could I really let go? Could I really release all the hurt that had been defining me for decades? Was I ready to forgive not Lucas or Maddie, but myself? I didn't have all the answers yet. But I knew this was the beginning. This silence, this space, this was where the change would happen. The next morning, the house still felt different. It wasn't just the absence of Lucas or Maddie, it was the absence of that suffocating tension that had filled the air for so long. The truth was, I hadn't just been angry at them. I had been angry at myself too, angry for failing, angry for not being the father I thought I should have been, angry for not seeing the cracks in our relationship before they became too deep to repair. But as I stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered street, I realized that holding onto that anger wasn't making anything better. It wasn't making me better. It was time to accept what I couldn't change. Time to accept that Lucas had made his choices, and that no amount of anger would bring him back to me as the son I once knew. He wasn't the same person anymore. He was lost in his own way, and no amount of resentment from me would fix that. I had spent so much time wishing he could be different, wishing for things to go back to how they were. But the truth was, they couldn't, not now, not ever, and that was okay. Acceptance didn't mean I condoned his actions or that I didn't feel the sting of betrayal. It simply meant that I was no longer going to waste my energy holding onto something that couldn't be fixed. I couldn't change the past, and I couldn't force someone to be who I wanted them to be. But I could control how I reacted to it. I closed my eyes and let out a slow breath, feeling the tension that had held me for so long slowly begin to loosen. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't easy, but in this moment I finally realized that the past no longer had the power to control me. As the days passed, I started to make small changes. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't think it was the right time to make grand, sweeping decisions. No. This was about taking baby steps, letting go of the heavy burden bit by bit. I cleaned out the garage. It was something I'd been putting off for years, but for some reason it felt like a good place to start. I dusted off old boxes, threw out things that no longer mattered, and reorganized. It felt strangely cathartic, like I was clearing out the clutter not just in my physical space, but in my mind as well. I went for long walks in the park by myself, with no agenda other than to breathe and to be present. The snow-covered trees, the way the sunlight bounced off the white powder, there was beauty everywhere. I had been so consumed with anger for so long that I hadn't noticed how much life had passed me by. It wasn't just about doing things to distract myself. It was about reconnecting with the world around me, and in that space I began to feel lighter. I wasn't carrying the weight of regret anymore. I was allowing myself to feel peace. One evening after a particularly long walk, I sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames easing the chill from my bones. I stared into the crackling embers, the shadows dancing on the walls, and thought about everything that had happened. I thought about Lucas. I thought about Maddie. I thought about the years of missed moments, the broken promises, the silence between us. There had been so much pain, so many moments when I could have done things differently. But then I realized I had to let it go. I couldn't carry the anger anymore. It wasn't that I was going to forgive them for everything they'd done. Not yet, at least, but I wasn't going to let that anger rule my life anymore. I had been holding on to it for so long that it had become a part of my identity. But now I understood that my anger was only holding me back. It was keeping me stuck in the past, trapped in the pain of what had happened. It was time to release it, not for their sake, but for mine. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked outside once more. The snow was falling again. Soft and gentle, like a blanket of peace being laid over the world. I didn't need to know all the answers. I didn't need to have the last word. What I needed was to stop clinging to the past and start building something new. For the first time in years, I felt free. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if a fog had lifted from my mind and I could finally see the path forward. The first thing I did was make a cup of coffee, sit down at the table, and open my phone. I made a list of things I wanted to do, things I had put off for years because I was too consumed by my past. I called an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in ages, and set up a time to meet. I signed up for an art class, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time for. I took small steps toward a new life. One where I wasn't constantly looking back, always waiting for the past to come to me. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the old pain crept back in, when I wanted to pick up the phone and call Lucas, when I wanted to fix things that weren't mine to fix. But each time I reminded myself that the power to move forward was in my hands. I wasn't a victim of the past anymore. I was the author of my own future. And that, more than anything, was the inner shift I had been waiting for. The day was finally here, the day I had been waiting for, planning for, strategizing for. I had sat through months of internal struggle, of emotional turbulence, and it had led me to this moment. I had collected every piece of evidence, every document, every secret that had been buried under layers of lies, and now it was time to reveal the truth. The truth Lucas had tried so hard to hide, the truth Maddie had helped him mask. I sat at my desk in my study, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the folders before me. My fingers brushed against the papers, and for a moment I allowed myself a breath. This wasn't just about exposing them, not about revenge. It was about justice, my justice. It was about taking control of my life and finally facing down the ghosts of my past. No more hiding, no more silences, no more waiting for someone else to fix the mess they created. The weight of the folders was heavy, but so was the weight of my own feelings. The long years of being trapped in anger, feeling betrayed, feeling like I was nothing but a pawn in their game, were finally over. Today, I would take back what was mine. Today, Lucas and Maddie would have to face the consequences of their actions, the consequences of their deceit. The phone call I was about to make wasn't just to any lawyer. It was to someone who had been part of my strategy for months. Someone who knew every detail of the situation and understood the gravity of what was at stake. I had planned everything meticulously, waiting for the right moment to strike, and now it was time. I picked up the phone and dialed the number that had been programmed into my memory. I knew what was coming, but the moment still felt surreal, like stepping into a new reality. "Hello," came the voice on the other end. "It's time," I said, my voice low but resolute. I didn't need to explain further. The other person on the line knew exactly what that meant. "Are you sure?" the lawyer asked, sensing the weight of what I was about to do. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through me. The lawyer confirmed everything once more, every piece of evidence, every document, every plan. The strategy was in place, and it was flawless. Lucas and Maddie wouldn't be able to worm their way out of it this time. This time, they were going to pay for what they had done. I hung up the phone and sat back, letting out a long exhale. The air in the room felt different now. The calm after the storm had passed, and what remained was the clarity of purpose. The time had arrived. I drove to Lucas's house, my heart pounding in my chest. The night air was cold, but it didn't chill me. My resolve was firm. As I parked outside his large, well-maintained home, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. For so long, he had lived in his carefully constructed world, hiding behind his charm, his manipulations, but tonight the facade would fall. I walked up the path toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, but also filled with the kind of certainty I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just walking to confront Lucas. I was walking toward the end of my own emotional prison. It had taken me a long time to get here, but now there was no turning back. The door opened, and Lucas stood there, wearing his usual confident smile. But today, that smile seemed a little too forced, a little too practiced. I could see the nervousness in his eyes, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of confidence. "Dad, you made it. Come on in," he said, stepping aside, gesturing for me to enter. I didn't return his smile. I wasn't here for pleasantries. I wasn't here to reconnect. I was here to end the game once and for all. I walked past him, not bothering to respond. He didn't know it yet. But everything was about to change. We made our way to the living room. The tension was thick between us, like an unspoken storm hanging in the air. I sat down across from him, watching as he hesitated for a moment, then sat down too. The silence stretched out, and I could feel his unease growing with each passing second. He must have known something was wrong. He must have known that this wasn't just a friendly visit. "You wanted to talk," I said, breaking the silence. My voice was steady even, but beneath it, I could feel the years of pain and betrayal waiting to burst through. "So let's talk," Lucas swallowed hard. His eyes darted from me to the briefcase I had placed on the table. I knew what he was thinking. He had no idea what was coming. He was still too arrogant, too convinced that he could charm his way out of anything. But not this time. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the first folder. I slid it across the table to him, watching his face change as he read the first page. His eyes widened, then narrowed, his breath catching in his throat. "What is this?" Lucas asked, his voice rising in surprise and confusion. He quickly flipped through the documents, his hands trembling slightly. "This," I said, my voice unwavering, "is everything you've been hiding, everything you thought you could get away with." I could see the shift in him. The cocky confidence that had once dominated his presence was quickly replaced with confusion and fear. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to handle this, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. For the first time in years, I saw the real Lucas, the one who couldn't manipulate the truth anymore, the one who couldn't hide behind his charm. This can't be true," Lucas stammered, looking at me with disbelief. "It's all here," I said, leaning forward slightly, my tone firm. "The bankruptcy filings, the hidden debts, the fraudulent investments. You thought you could get away with all of it, but you were wrong." Lucas's face paled as he continued flipping through the documents. Each piece of evidence I presented shattered his illusion of control. His fingers shook with a mix of disbelief and fear. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't defend himself. I slid another document across the table, this time a tax evasion report. Lucas recoiled, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a way to explain himself, but he couldn't. "You've been lying to me for years." I continued, "You've been hiding this from me, from everyone, but not anymore." The weight of the words hung in the air between us. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Lucas's labored breathing as he processed the sheer magnitude of his actions. "I didn't want this to happen," Lucas said, his voice small, almost pleading now. "I didn't mean for it to get so out of control." "It's too late for apologies," I replied. My voice cold and resolute. "You've made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences." Just then Maddie walked into the room. She stopped short when she saw the documents on the table, and her eyes immediately darted from Lucas to me. She had been standing on the sidelines, watching, but now the reality of what was happening hit her too. Her usual cold demeanor faltered for a split second, and I could see her scrambling for control. "Maddie," I said, turning to face her, "you didn't think you'd get away with this, did you?" Her expression hardened as she crossed her arms, trying to appear unfazed. "You don't understand," she said, her voice clipped. "This is just business. We did what we had to do." "Business," I repeated, leaning forward. "You've been manipulating me, using me to cover up your failures. Don't pretend you didn't know exactly what was happening." Maddie's eyes shifted, the guilt in them betraying her. She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the panic rising in her chest. She had no escape. The walls were closing in around her. With the documents laid bare, the final blow was inevitable. The truth had been exposed. Lucas's financial empire was crumbling. The deceit, the lies, and the manipulation were all out in the open. There was no place left for them to hide. Lucas's breakdown was swift. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of himself, now looked like a shell of the person he had been. His face was pale, his eyes wild, his breath shallow. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. He couldn't comprehend that he had lost control. As for Maddie, she tried to regain her composure, but it was too late. The truth had stripped away the mask she had worn for so long. She could no longer control the narrative. "I didn't want it to be like this," Lucas whispered, his voice broken. "I didn't want to lose everything." "You already have," I replied, my voice final, "and you can't undo it." The confrontation was over. The truth had been exposed. And I stood there watching as the weight of it all crashed down on them. But I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt, for the first time in years, was freedom. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about making them feel the same pain I had felt. It was about reclaiming my own power. It was about taking control of my life again and letting go of the anger and resentment that had consumed me for so long. I had fought for this moment, not just for justice, but for closure, for peace. I turned and walked out of the room, not looking back. The weight of the past was finally lifted, and for the first time in years, I was free to move forward. The house had been silent for days. The echoes of the confrontation with Lucas and Maddie still lingered in my mind, like a dull ache that would not go away. But as the days passed, that pain began to transform into something else, something softer, less consuming. I had seen the destruction. I had felt the weight of betrayal and anger, but now there was peace. The kind of peace that only comes after the storm has passed, when everything settles and you can breathe again. I stood by the window, looking out at the calm of the neighborhood. The snow had stopped falling and the sky was beginning to clear. The world was quiet, as if waiting for me to make my next move. And I knew deep down that it wasn't just the world outside that had changed. I had changed too. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first walked into that house, angry, consumed by years of hurt and bitterness. I wasn't the same person who had lived in the shadow of resentment for so long. I had gone through something that had shifted the very core of who I was, something deeper than the rage, something more powerful than the need for revenge. I had learned to let go. And now, with all that had happened, I felt the emptiness inside me begin to fill, not with more anger or bitterness, but with a quiet sense of acceptance. It was over. It had to be. There was no going back. I sat down at the table, staring at the mess of papers and documents that had been spread out during the confrontation. All the evidence I had gathered, all the secrets I had uncovered, they were now nothing more than remnants of a time that had passed. The need to hold onto those pieces of the past had slipped away, and now all I had left was the feeling of closure. What did it all mean? Why had I gone through so much to bring this to an end? Why had I let myself be consumed by the need for justice for so long? I reached for the journal I kept by my side, something I had used to write my thoughts down during the darkest times. As I opened the pages, I was reminded of the person I had been, someone who was afraid, someone who clung to the pain because it felt familiar. The pain had been my constant companion for years. It had become a part of who I was, but as I read my own words, I realized how far I had come, how much I had changed. The person I had been, the man who had been betrayed, who had been abandoned, was gone. I had let him go. The truth had been laid bare, and with it, my need for revenge had disappeared. Justice had been served, yes, but in the process I had learned something far more important. I had learned to forgive, not just Lucas and Maddie, but myself. I had been holding on to the idea that they owed me something, that I needed them to pay for the hurt they had caused me, but now I saw it differently. They had already paid in their own way, and I had already paid too. The anger, the bitterness, it had all been my choice, and now I had the power to choose differently. Forgiveness had always seemed like something out of reach, something too difficult to attain. I had spent years thinking that forgiveness was about them, that it was about Lucas and Maddie saying they were sorry, admitting what they had done. But now I understood that forgiveness wasn't about them at all. It was about me. I didn't have to forgive them for their actions. They had their own journey to make. But I had to forgive myself for letting their actions control me for so long. I had to forgive myself for letting their mistakes become my own. I had to forgive myself for waiting for someone else to make it right when I could have done it all along. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing their actions. It was about releasing the hold they had over me. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment. And as I sat there, holding the journal in my hands, I realized that I had already begun that process. The heavy weight that had been lodged in my chest for so many years was finally lifting. The sense of peace that had seemed impossible was now within my reach. The process of letting go wasn't easy. There were moments when I still felt the urge to reach out, to call Lucas, to demand an apology. There were moments when I wondered if things could have been different, if only I had done things differently. But each time that thought crossed my mind, I reminded myself of something I had learned. The past was the past. It could not be changed. There was no point in reliving those old wounds. There was no point in rehashing the same conversations over and over again in my head. The truth was that I had done everything I could to fix things, and sometimes fixing things meant walking away. I thought about the future, about what I wanted from my life. I thought about the things I had put off, things I had abandoned in favor of holding onto the pain of the past. There were dreams I had forgotten about, passions I had let fade. It was time to revive those parts of me. It was time to start living for myself again. I walked outside into the crisp morning air, the world still blanketed in snow. The streets were quiet, the sounds of the world muffled by the white powder. For a moment, it felt like I was the only person left on Earth, standing in a world untouched, a world full of possibilities. It was the kind of stillness I had been craving, peaceful, calm, free from the chaos of the past. I had finally broken free. I wasn't bound by the mistakes of others, and I wasn't bound by my own guilt or anger. I had taken control of my life, and I was ready to face the future. There were many things I didn't know. I didn't know where life would take me or what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt okay with that. I didn't need to have all the answers. I didn't need to know every step of the journey. What I needed was to move forward, to embrace the unknown, to allow myself to grow. The road ahead was mine to shape. It wasn't defined by the past. It wasn't defined by what had happened with Lucas or Maddie. It was mine to create one step at a time. As I walked down the path, I found myself smiling. It was a quiet, contented smile. For the first time in so long, I felt like I was truly myself, unburdened, unafraid, and ready for whatever life had in store. I wasn't who I used to be. I wasn't the person who had been defined by betrayal and resentment. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned the power of letting go, the strength of forgiveness, and the importance of moving forward. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on.